possible.
Glad you're here. Thanks so much for coming today. As a reminder, please do silence your phone. After this conversation, the authors will be walking over to that tent right there where you can buy their books, and then on the other side you can have your book signed and say a couple of words to the author. All right, well, thank you so much for coming to this really important session today. I am first just going to introduce the authors. Shane Bauer, he is a senior reporter for Mother Jones. He is the recipient of the National Magazine Award for Best Reporting, Harvard's Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting, Atlantic Media's Michael Kelly Award, the Hillman Prize for Magazine Journalism, and at least 20 others. He is the co-author. Woohoo! Go Shane. He is the co-author of the memoir A Sliver of Light about his time spent as a prisoner in Iran. He spent 2 years in prison as a journalist. When he came home, he began reporting on American prisons. In 2014, he went undercover as a prison guard for 4 months and published a long-form piece in Mother Jones about his experience. He then published American Prisoner. Woo! A book that expands on that experience and also includes a history of for-profit prisons in the U.S., tracing back to slavery. It also includes photographs and a detailed architectural rendering of the penitentiary he worked at. I tore through this book and was so haunted by it, and I feel like it's a really important book that everyone needs to read. Debra Jo Immergut is the author of the novel The Captives. It just came out a few months ago, and she's also the author of the story collection Private Property. She's a McDowell and Michener Fellow, and she has an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop. Not shabby. She has taught in libraries, military bases, and prisons on and off since, I think she said, since 1997.
That's right.
Her literary work has been published in American short fiction, narrative, and foreign literature. Her journalism has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the New York Magazine, and many other places. This novel, The Captives, tells the story of a young incarcerated woman. Debra says in an interview about writing the book that it was inspired by working with people who, quote, have been regulated to the very fringes of American society as if they have nothing to offer. In fact, through teaching in correctional facilities, I've discovered the opposite is true. I'm so pleased to have them both with me today. But I'm not pleased about the flies. Okay, so my first question is for both of you, and I just want to ask you about inspiration. I want to ask Shane, what was it that inspired you to take such an extreme measure of going undercover? And I want to ask Debra, what was it about teaching in prison that inspired this narrative spark that led to writing an entire novel about it?
Well, I had been spending a few years kind of reporting on criminal justice in prisons after I myself got out of prison. I was really drawn to the American prison system. You know, we have 25% of the world's prisoners here, largest prison system by far. And I was constantly frustrated at how difficult it is to get access to prisons. It has actually gotten more difficult over the recent decades, more difficult for journalists to get inside and for us to know what's happening inside prisons. Even getting just basic information is hard. We have, states have public access laws where we can get, records, kind of basic data, but in many states you can't even get that stuff without suing the state. And I was interested in private prisons. I'd kind of poked around at them. People have written about them quite a bit, but it's generally based on lawsuits, people suing the prisons. And these prisons are even more difficult to get access to because they're not, they're private companies. So oftentimes even these public records laws don't apply. We can't even get the kind of basic information. So I had also read Ted Conover's book, New Jack, which is about his time as a prison guard in the late 90s in New York. And, I just thought, like, maybe I should try this for private prisons. And honestly, it was kind of a whim. Like, I didn't think it was going to work. I just filled out an application on the website. It took an hour, and I didn't lie, and then within a couple weeks, I was getting phone calls and requests for job interviews.
Thanks.
So you asked about narrative spark, and one thing you quickly realize when you go inside a prison is that they are full of stories, full to the brim. The first incarcerated person I ever met was a woman imprisoned for a very long sentence in federal corrections in Danbury, Connecticut, and she had been involved in the last gasp of the radical leftist underground of the 70s and 80s. And by the time I met her, it was the late 90s, and she had been in already a long time. She was from a fairly privileged background. It was fascinating to me, the choices she'd made, and of course, as a novelist, that's something you can't resist delving into. And I was in with her to teach her. She was taking writing classes inside, and the further I got into that world, the more people I met, the more I understood that there's really no other place in our society where the stark drama of chance, choice, accidents of birth, redemption, these are just so starkly on display inside a prison. So it just grabbed me and wouldn't let me go.
That's great. Yeah. So another thing that I wanted to ask you guys both about is that you both have experiences in prisons that are quite different from the kinds of prisons that we have now. Shane, of course, was in a prison in Iran, and Debra has been teaching in prisons for so many years, and in 1997 we really were more than a decade into mass incarceration, but I do think it was before we have the kinds of systems set up for prisons that we do now. And so I'm just wondering if you both could talk about the differences between the prisons in Iran and here, and also the prisons between several decades ago and what they're like now.
I just say briefly that prisons in this country vary so much. So my first experience was out of federal corrections, and now I teach in a small county prison in my home state of Massachusetts, and in a men's prison. So even over all those years, and even now, you'll go in, you'll see incredibly different conditions throughout. But I would say, as you mentioned, it's the numbers. In the 90s, there would have probably been less than 1 million people incarcerated, and now I think the number's over 2 million.
Yeah, 2.3. No, I would reiterate that. I mean, I think comparing prisons within the U.S., there's more difference in some ways than between the prison I was in Iran and the one that I worked in Louisiana. I mean, we have a prison in California where people are held in solitary confinement for years, sometimes 20, 30, and 40 years. And the prison I was at Wynn they were in dorms, so it'd be like 44 guys in a dorm together. And I guess, it's very difficult to compare prisons, and especially to, judge what's better or worse, so I'm not going to do that. But in Iran, the prison I was in a ward of the central prison, which was a political ward. So it was a political prison. There were a lot of pro-democracy activists were being held there. That was the majority of the prisoners. We were in isolation, which was either solitary confinement, which I spent 4 months in, or with your cellmate, but you're not interacting with the people outside. You leave your cell, you're blindfolded. You would have sessions of interrogations. People were physically tortured. So that prison in some ways was highly controlled. And Wynn was in some ways the opposite of that. It was, prison is run at a profit. So every chance to cut corners was taken, which meant that there were 1,500 prisoners and around 25 guards on a shift. It meant that there was, one part-time psychiatrist for the whole prison. It meant that the healthcare was so bad that people were literally losing limbs in the prison. And it was just it was so bare bones that it was just utterly chaotic and violent, and was just limping along day to day, trying to continue and stay in business, really, which was under threat a lot of the time because it was just really falling apart.
Wow. Yeah, it's really dark. I mean, I feel like the two of you have such a different experience of being inside a United States prison. We were talking just before the panel about how, being an educator is so different from being a guard, that you have, being an educator, the men really want to be there. Well, I'm going to let you guys talk about this. So I'm wondering if Debra, if you could talk a little bit about how you feel like your experience is really different from Shane's, and then maybe Shane, you could say whether or not you think that's right.
So typically, if there is an education program in a correctional facility, this is the best place inside the walls. And the men or women who are coming into the classroom, for them this is really a respite. They may have horrible associations with school, right? Many of these people have been failed repeatedly by their schools as young people, as children. But still, this is a quiet atmosphere, and that I think is sort of top of mind for me and for a lot of them when they come in, because one thing you hear about is just the unstoppable noise of when they're on their units. So a classroom is pretty calm, it's pretty quiet, and I think they really welcome the chance to bend their minds to something that has nothing to do with the stressful environment that they're experiencing inside. So it's a real privilege for me and for the other teachers that I work alongside to be able to kind of bring the light in to these very dark places, and to experience these folks who are kind of at their best in the classroom.
Yeah, and how about you, Shane? Because it's so interesting. In the book, he talks about how he goes in there with this idea that he is one kind of guard that he's going to be, and then he winds up not actually being able to sustain that. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah, well, I just want to say also that, of course, people want opportunities. People want opportunities for education, for work. I think there are very few people in prison that don't want that. The issue is that it barely exists. There are some programs that, that you guys have been a part of, and that people do find some opportunities, but where I was, people were constantly frustrated that they just didn't have that, and that environment, it creates a very, very toxic environment. I mean, I was in a male prison. The men are essentially warehoused. They're just living for years in these dorms, going to the chow hall, coming back. The warden said to us in a meeting once that we are to see them as a herd of cattle, going from the pasture to the barn. And that's the whole mentality of the place. You're just feeding these people and locking them up. And to be someone working in that environment is also incredibly toxic. I mean, I went in not so much with the idea that I wanted to write about what it was like to be a guard. It was my way to get inside the prison and see the day-to-day life in a private prison. And I thought, I would just kind of be an easygoing guard, just hang back and stay out of people's way. But it was not that easy, and I saw myself changing very fast. And I saw other people as well, other cadets that I went through training with. You have to imagine you're in a unit of 350 prisoners, and there's you and one other guard. You don't have any weapons. You just have a radio, and you're just basically you learn that your main purpose is just to figure out how to clock in and clock out and just kind of get through the day, do the bare minimum. Guards are not, it's literally impossible to do the things we're meant to do because there's just not enough people. So that pressure really wears on you. And, the part of me initially that might feel, I had an inner conflict because I had been a prisoner. One time I found a cell phone and, I was conflicted about what to do, because when I was a prisoner, I would have died to have a cell phone, and that was still a part of my identity, but my job was to take it, and I took it, and part of me felt bad about it. Prisoners use phones to bring in drugs, stuff like that. Do I really care that people are using drugs? I mean, I don't know, but I had to turn that part of myself off, that would feel any compunction about what I was doing, and it made my job a lot easier, and it made me harden a lot and just become kind of a stereotypical guard that was, just punishing people all the time.
Yeah, that was something that I really wanted to touch on here is, so in Shane's book, he talks a lot about the history of for-profit prisons in the United States, which I guess originated here, the concept of for-profit prisons. And so, but the way that profit has been made has changed drastically over the last 50 years. And I was going to ask Shane if maybe he could touch on a little bit of that. And then as a corollary, I wanted to ask Debra if she could talk a little bit about something that has also developed a lot in the last 50 years in prisons, which is the use of pharmaceuticals. Take it away.
Well, something that is important to note is that first of all, prisons as we know them, what used to be called penitentiaries, were invented in this country as a reform. So rather than hang somebody who had committed a crime, you give him a sentence. But really from the very beginning, prisons were intended to make a profit, and did. By the 1820s, prisons were making a profit. They were using, prisoners were contracted to private, contractors at that time. Their labor was contracted. And then after the Civil War, this system, prisons, people who had owned slaves wanted to continue the system of slavery, and they essentially convinced other states throughout the South to lease them their prisoners as labor. So the prisoners would be put to work on plantations. They would be put in coal mines. They would be laying railroad tracks. They would be, whipped for not picking cotton fast enough, and they were living, essentially filling the role of slaves. I also will mention, just back up, before the Civil War, Texas, the prisons in Texas are along a river. The reason for that is because those were plantations, and those plantations became, were then leased to, the prisoners were leased to those plantations after the Civil War. They had been slave plantations, then they were places where prisoners were sent, and then they just became prisons. And the prisons themselves were run as plantations, where prisoners were forced to labor for dawn until dusk, really until the 1970s. Texas also, its first penitentiary became the state's largest factory. before the Civil War, the South was using prisons as a way to industrialize. They were essentially factories, and it was the largest producer of textiles west of the Mississippi. And really, this system of forced labor was the norm until the 1970s. Even after the kind of convict leasing system ended, states were running plantations themselves, and the profit would go directly into state treasuries. And interestingly and significantly, one of the co-founders of the Corrections Corporation of America, which is the company that ran the prison that I was undercover in, he started his career running a prison plantation in Texas in 1967 that was the size of Manhattan. It was a cotton plantation. Prisoners are forced to pick cotton from dawn till dusk. Him and his family lived on the plantation. Prisoners that were called houseboys would serve him and his family on the plantation. And he would run plantations at a profit. He was really the last person to run public prisons at a profit. Today, public prisons lose a lot of money. And as the kind of mass incarceration started, the prison population boomed. States were scrambling to build prisons. The Southern system shifted from a system of labor camps to what is more like the system today, where people are just kind of warehoused. And some businessmen approached him and proposed the idea of starting a company where instead of making money from the labor of prisoners, the prisoners themselves would be the commodities. So today, the way that private prisons work is that states pay the company a rate every day to hold them, and then they're also traded on the stock market. So they've taken labor really out of the equation.
So Shane mentioned the boom in prison population that accounts for the rise of private prisons. Well, why are prison populations booming? To a large extent, it was been driven by increasingly punitive drug laws, which put many nonviolent offenders behind bars, and sometimes for very, very long sentences. And they have to have a place to put these people. Okay, so you asked about pharmaceuticals. These are people with substance abuse issues many times. And they are people who need treatment, and often they don't have opportunities for treatment inside. That's pretty rare. There's some lip service to it, and some states do better than others, some counties do better than others, but generally they're thrown in. They've already been in the world of drugs, many times serious users of drugs, particularly women, by the way. Female incarcerated people tend to be much more apt to be drug users. And so it's not surprising then that these systems are awash in drugs, because there are many ways to get this stuff in. And I'll just say that, in the course of teaching, and we are writing and we're chatting about our lives, I hear stories. One of the guys that I taught talked about how they all knew that you could get somebody from home to throw a softball over the wall. They were nice and big, and there was plenty of room to put stuff in. And in one case, he even told me that there was a dead cat thrown over. And I thought, okay, but how do you get? So these are usually very large properties. How are you going to get that softball or that dead cat full of drugs? And he said, oh, well, you have a friend who works on the landscape crew, and he gets it for you, and it's all set up ahead of time, and that's how it's done. And I thought, okay, well, that's very creative and inventive. And these are people with excellent brains, as I've seen in my classroom. So sometimes they bend their brains toward getting the drugs that they want, and that they are sometimes very addicted to. And the last thing I'll say about pharmaceuticals inside is that on the flip side, I've heard some of my students who are struggling with depression, with anxiety. I mean, all too often. They have all kinds of mental illness, which on the outside are pretty treatable. We know what the medications are, and we take them, and so many of us do. But they have a very hard time getting those. So you can imagine if you're in and you have a serious depression, or you have anxiety issues, and you can't get those basic meds that are so commonly available on the outside, that's going to make life a lot harsher for you.
Could I just say something jumping off of that? I mentioned earlier that the prison I was in had one part-time psychiatrist. The main, other than seeing this psychiatrist when they had a chance, if a prisoner had a serious mental health issue, which they told us about a third did, they would often go on suicide watch. They would say they're suicidal, and they're essentially put in solitary confinement where a guard has to sit and watch them. They have no clothes, no mattress. They actually would get worse food, the caloric value of which was less than USDA standards. And we were told in training that part of the reason they did this is because sometimes people would say they were suicidal just because they wanted to get away from other people they had problems with. So they tried to make it as undesirable as possible because it costs a lot of money to have people on suicide watch because they have to pay one guard to watch one prisoner as opposed to 175. So there was a guy who I watched on my first day on the job. I had to do the suicide watch, and this guy didn't want me sitting there. He was yelling at me. It was very unpleasant 12 hours. He told me he was going to jump off his bed and break his neck, and I had to report it, and psychiatrist came like 6 hours later. But after I left the prison, I won't say what happened when I left, but it was kind of the whole project fell apart in some ways, and there was some publicity around the fact that I'd been there as a reporter, and a woman saw that, and she contacted me through a lawyer and asked me if I knew this guy, Damien Costley, and I said that I had guarded him, and she told me he committed suicide, and she allowed me to look through a lot of his documents and stuff like that, and I learned that he had been actually going on hunger strike to demand mental health services in the prison, and he could not get them, and when he died, he weighed 71 pounds. And just the little coda to this was the company claims that they have a lower suicide rate than public prisons. And when I heard about what happened with Damien, I did a records request for the state of Louisiana and asked them how many suicides had occurred that year in the prison, and they told me 0. And what happened was when Damien hanged himself, he was in a coma, and he was sent to the hospital where he stayed for a week before he died. And during that time, the warden granted him compassionate release. So the company kept it off the books because he technically didn't die in the prison.
I know, it's really upsetting. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to mention about that, about the pharmaceuticals, is that one thing that I really, really loved about Debra's book is that it's part of it is told from the point of view of a psychiatrist who's working inside the prison, and one of these, part-time guys, and it's really fascinating to see his take on what's happening with these women. It's a women's prison, so I want to get to questions from you guys. So I'm just going to ask these guys one more question, and then open it up to you. Please do use the microphone. The last question I'm going to ask you is, the two of you approach advocacy from very different angles. One of you, is working in education in the prisons. The other one of you is working sort of on public policy. And I'm wondering, what can the public do to help with all of this?
There are so many different ways to help and so many needs. I would point people who are interested in getting involved to a couple of organizations I really admire. One is called Cut 50. They are a group who are advocating for prison reform at the federal level, and they have a lot of excellent initiatives and informations, and they're online. And the other is the Marshall Project, which is a fantastic advocacy group, and their website is full of first-person voices from both guards and incarcerated people, and so they have that's a wonderful resource too. And the other thing I would say, almost every state has a group that's sending books to people in prison, and as we were just talking about before, sometimes these are not being allowed. I mean, there are laws now, and there are places in our country where they've banned books in prison, all books. But just as coming as an educator, I love those groups that are collecting books and sending them. And there is, we think you've always heard about the prison library, but they're pretty sad places. So that's one way that's pretty easy and very fitting for this setting too.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like affecting individual prisoners, I think books is really so important. I mean, as a prisoner, I cared at some point, honestly, and this is part of the twisted mentality of being a prisoner, but I cared more about getting books than getting out was like a farther off idea, but I really just wanted books. And there are organizations that do that. I don't know if there's some here. I actually donated a portion of the proceeds from my book to some of these organizations. So you can, donate money or books to them, or you can volunteer with them. And then as far as private prison stuff, I mean, I don't know what's happening here, but I know that there's been a lot of student organizing about divestment from private prisons. A lot of mutual funds invest in private prisons, so some of you may be investing in private prisons without knowing it. There are some tools online that people have come up with to find out if that's the case. And then, there are also, Cut 50 is great, and there are, I'm from California, and I know, there's some kind of websites that will just have a list of organizations. Where I live, there's a Prison Activist Resource Center, and I think they have stuff around the country too, but I would just, find out what yours is here.
Thanks. Well, I would love to hear questions from you guys. I'm sure that we have all kinds of questions. Please use the microphone.
This actually isn't a question. I'm just going to say that the local place where you can volunteer is Inside Books Project, and you can volunteer Sundays and Thursdays, but sign up in advance because they have very limited spots. So.
Hi. I'm wondering, you hear from the current administration some intermittent news that maybe Jared Kushner is working on prison reform or that they're somewhat open to prison reform. I'm wondering if either of you have an opinion or could address what, if any, effects there have been from the current administration on incarceration in America, what there might be vis-a-vis this particular administration.
From what I've followed of that, it's a bipartisan. There is a bipartisan bill. Jared Kushner has been involved in getting it put together. It's actually something that has been in the works for a long time, but he's gotten involved with it. It does have support on both sides of the aisle. Attorney General Sessions has given a lot of pushback. He tends to come from the punishment side of things and not the rehabilitation. And so it got some momentum early this year, I think in February, and then it stalled. And just lately, I see that they've been reviving it. Earlier this month, they had another press conference where they're trying to push it forward, but it's going very, very slowly. So I would say so far under this administration, it's pretty much status quo, and in some respects, I think, and maybe Shane can talk about it, there's been some rollback. Yeah,
I think Sessions was a surprise to a lot of people who were paying close attention to prisons because there was a lot of bipartisan agreement on the need, one, to decriminalize drugs and to deal with mandatory minimum sentences. And Sessions has really kind of brought back the war on terror, the war on drugs rhetoric. And then with private prisons in particular, at the end of the Obama presidency, the Justice Department announced that they were going to stop using private prisons. And this really, really affected the two major private prison companies. Their stock price dropped by half overnight. the day that Trump won the election, the opposite happened, and the stock price of the Corrections Corporation of America rose more than any company in the stock market, probably because people were expecting that he would follow through on his campaign promises, crack down on immigration even harder than Obama had. And then the Trump administration immediately, I think it was in the first month or two, rolled back the Obama-era decision. So, the companies are doing very well right now.
Thanks.
Okay, yes. What is your opinion, comment, or impression of the faith-based groups that proselytize in prison to the prisoners?
Such a great question.
Well, you take that one.
I actually do not have any experience with them because I'm in the classroom and they are not in the classroom. I don't know, Deb, if you do.
I do, yeah. So I teach in a maximum security prison in southern Texas. I run the Penn City Writers Program, which we also take book donations. And there are a lot of faith-based groups there. I feel like what happened was that in the 80s, the Pell Grants were taken away for incarcerated people, and a lot of college programs closed inside of prisons. And and what filled the void that they left was faith-based groups. And it's a very strong contingent. There's a really interesting book about it called God in Captivity that you might want to read if you're interested in that. And it focuses a lot on Texas prisons.
Hi, I'm from UC Berkeley. And Shane, after you were taken prisoner, I met with your mom and with Josh's brother to help generate some press around your captivity. And we were trying to do what we could. Sorry we couldn't do more. And I'm wondering how your family felt about you going back into a prison, and if you had an exit date in mind for when you were going to stop your employment, and what your employer's reaction was when the book came out.
I was very nervous about telling them, all of them, but they were really supportive. Actually, they were a little bit nervous, but thought it was a good idea, I think. And I haven't actually heard from the company since the book came out, but I did when I left the job, this was in 2015. They found out I was a reporter, and they threatened to sue Mother Jones if we published the article. They sent us several letters threatening to sue us. But ultimately, they didn't have any basis for a lawsuit. I never lied. And they had actually offered me a job promotion while I was there, so they couldn't, say I was trying to sabotage them. And when the article came out, they basically did like a one-page write-up and sent it around to reporters, but it didn't really catch. They're trying to discredit me, but they were saying like you should have reported what you saw to your supervisor rather than writing about it, that kind of stuff. But that's really it. I haven't heard from them since the book came out. I did go, attended a shareholder meeting. I bought one share of the company so that I could go. So that was my only way to actually interact with the executives from the company, because none of them would talk to me throughout the entire process. So it was my opportunity to ask a question, because every shareholder gets to ask a question. But even after the meeting, I couldn't even get close to them. They all left the room immediately. And yeah, that was it.
Thank you both. I'm a filmmaker. Shane, you said something in the beginning about access to the inside. And as a filmmaker, I've tried several times to get permission to interview people and film things in prisons. And because I'm an independent and I'm not affiliated with a national news organization, I've been rejected. And I think answering the question, what can we do as taxpayers and voters to improve conditions, I think one is to allow cameras inside so that people can see what really happens and how horribly people are treated. And I just say that passionately because I know that national news organizations just aren't necessarily interested in this kind of reporting, and there are a lot of independent filmmakers who are. So on our behalf, I speak. And my question, Shane, is did you deal with a lot of PTSD after these experiences? Because we know that the conditions in prisons really often lead prisoners coming out to suffer a lot of PTSD in their reentry, and it's something that is a real serious problem, and it makes it very difficult for people to make lifelong changes. So what was the experience for you in coming out?
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and it's, I think, maybe one of the least dealt with areas of incarceration. When I got out of prison myself, when I was a prisoner, I had a lot of PTSD, and I experienced things that, like, part of being a prisoner is you're institutionalized, and you actually lose the ability to make choices if you don't exercise that function. And when I got out, I dreamed of food in prison, what I was going to eat when I got out. And when I first went to a restaurant, I literally couldn't choose. And I just, for the first couple of weeks, I just had other people choose for me because I would just get stuck. And also, just dealing with complex, like being in a place like this would have been, there's so much stimulation. And I should say that I was in isolation, so it's going to manifest differently for different people, different prisoners, depending on their conditions. But, my brain would just get exhausted by having to learn again how to filter what is important and what isn't. But a thing that I see with prisoners a lot is, you have to be hypervigilant in prison. Prisons are violent, and the way that you survive inside prison does not work outside. In fact, it gets you in trouble, and it's hard for people to make that transition. It's bad enough that it's very difficult to get housing, very difficult to get work, and all of those things. But there's also a huge psychological component that is a major obstacle to reintegrating into society. When I came back from being a guard, it was very different. I think I was there by choice. It was a very meaningful project. So I kind of just, as difficult as that experience was, and as much as it affected me psychologically while I was there, once I left, it was kind of just, it was over.
Thank you.
Debra, you wrote a novel. Can you talk about your novel, about where it came from and what the story is? And public policy is nice, but what's your novel about?
I'd be very happy to. My novel is the story of a prison psychologist. He is in his 30s, and one day he comes to work on a Monday morning. His first client walks in the door, and he instantly recognizes her as a woman who he had a massive crush on all through high school. So it sort of starts with that interesting and maybe more lighthearted note than what we've been talking about here, but it really is about how this extreme condition and this extreme setting influences what goes on between these two people, and it really does explore the power dynamics inside, male and female power, authority versus the lack of power that an incarcerated individual has. So, but it is set off by a kind of universal high school crush story, and that's what the novel was about. I was interested in, I guess one of the things that we haven't talked about much is just the human dimension here. I mean, these are people with love lives, with children, the vast majority of my students have children, they're parents, they have wives, they have girlfriends, they have ex-girlfriends, they have, ex-husbands. And so all of that is brought inside, and they're people. People are people. This is the thing that I have learned over and over again. They have flaws just like we all have flaws. They have learning disabilities and mental health issues, just like so many of us do. So I really wanted to look at kind of a normal dynamic in a very abnormal setting.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to that something that I really loved about this book was that it wasn't like an advocacy book in the way that I imagined it would be when I just saw the cover or when I just read the description of what it is. It's like the prison is the setting, and these people, they are living their entire, they're living these incredibly long sentences, 25, 30, 35 years in this, and it just becomes that's just their life, and so they're still alive behind bars. It's not like their life just stops. They're not like chess pieces like taken off the board and are in pause. Their life continues. And what I loved so much about this book was that it was just about this life behind bars, and it was just really devastating and beautiful and important.
Just to go off that, I worked in the mailroom for a week in the prison that I was at, and sexuality in prison is very, very complicated. There's its own thing in some ways, and there is a lot of violence involved, and kind of sexual servitude and stuff like that. But when I worked in the mailroom, I ended up reading a lot of letters that were coming from other prisons, and they were from lovers from inside the prison. They're love letters that were getting sent from men, that got sent off to a maximum security prison that were now, and got pulled away from their lover in the prison. And it was very, I really got a glimpse into this world that was also very, just loving and gentle.
And I'll just add that a big part of my novel story is also about the friendships inside. And while it is a brutal atmosphere, there also become incredibly intense, supportive relationships that people find inside, and that helps my main character, Miranda, survive her female friendships.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. I'm going to try to do my part by running for the United States Congress and have prison reform at the top of it. So I'm going to run the next election cycle.
Woohoo!
Yes, and with like you, Shane, I bought several stocks, varying degrees in the big banks, and I'll be showing up at the shareholders meeting that finance the private prisons. That's really
great. Thank you. Well, that's all that we have time for today, and I'm so appreciative of everybody, all of your great questions. Please do go over to the tent and buy these books and talk more with the authors. You're supporting the book festival, which is not for profit, when you do so. And thank you.
And Book TV is live from the Texas Book Festival in Austin. Now, if you've missed any of our coverage today or want to know the schedule for the rest of the day, go to booktv.org. We'll be back in just a few minutes with more live coverage.